Welcome to Whispers in the Dark. Tonight, a summer camp nestled in the heart of the mountains hides a chilling secret. The lost whispers of Yellowstone Camp. The air at Yellowstone Camp had always smelled of pine and earth, the kind of fragrance that lingers long after you leave it behind. Ethan hadn't been back here in over a decade. Yet, as he stood at the camp's entrance, the familiar scent mixed with something else, something far less comforting. The whisper of distant winds felt like a warning brushing past his ear as if it carried secrets from a time long forgotten. 1,000 memories from his childhood flooded his mind, but it was the odd sensation in his chest that made him uneasy. His heart raced, not with excitement, but with a gnawing sense of dread. Ethan had returned to Camp Yellowstone to reclaim a part of himself, a chapter in his life that had been left unfinished. But now, with every step he took toward the cabins, every whisper of the wind through the trees, he wondered if that was the right choice. Ethan had spent 3 summers at this camp as a young boy, playing by the lake, fishing with the other kids, and laughing around the campfire with counselors who told stories of the old days. He remembered the way they would gather near the geysers at night, staring into the steam, listening to the rumble of the earth as if it were some secret the world was too frightened to speak. Back then it had all felt magical. Now, though, the camp felt different, stranger, older, as if it were a hollow shell. The buildings stood as they always had, but something was wrong with the land, with the very soil beneath his feet, as if something had been awakened in the years since he left. But what? Ethan paused as he passed the old wooden sign that marked the campgrounds. A chill ran down his spine, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder. The night was unusually silent, but the silence felt suffocating, like the kind you experience when you're not alone, but something is watching you from just beyond your sight. The children had arrived that afternoon, eager, excited faces, oblivious to the shadow hanging over them. The camp was as it always had been, a place for adventure and carefree days, a place to escape from the troubles of the world. But beneath the surface, Ethan could sense the unease growing, creeping into the smiles of the campers, the quiet murmurs between the counselors. And it wasn't just him. The whispers had already begun. Ethan stood in the center of the camp now, staring out at the geysers, the steam rising into the night sky like a veil between the camp and the outside world. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to them. The geysers. It was something about their rumbling, the way they seemed to pulse with life, like an ancient, forgotten heartbeat of the earth. He could hear it now, the faintest whisper carried by the wind, a soft murmur like a voice just on the edge of hearing. At first, he thought it was just the steam, the geysers, the land itself speaking in its ancient tongue. But then he heard it again, louder this time, clearer. Ethan. He froze. The voice wasn't just the wind, it was calling his name. It wasn't possible. He turned quickly, scanning the area, but there was no one there. But the whisper came again, this time closer, as if it had circled around him, coming from behind. Ethan. It was not just his name that echoed through the air. The voice carried something far darker, a deep sorrow that twisted through his chest and gripped his heart. He had to fight the instinct to turn and run. His feet were planted, but his mind screamed to leave, to get away from the sound that seemed to be coming from the geysers themselves. He took a breath, trying to calm his nerves. "That's just your imagination, Ethan. Nothing to fear," he muttered under his breath. But deep down, a part of him knew it was more than that. It wasn't just the wind, the steam, or his imagination. There was something here, something that had been here long before the camp had even been built, and it was reaching out to him now. The first night at camp passed uneventfully, but Ethan couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. The children were excited, their laughter echoing in the mess hall as they ate dinner and shared stories. But even they couldn't ignore the sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air, like a storm about to break. After the campfire, the counselors gathered, some of them talking amongst themselves, while others stood in silence, gazing out at the geysers. Ethan joined them, standing a little apart from the others, his eyes never straying far from the steam rising in the distance. He was about to speak to one of the counselors when a sharp scream cut through the night. The sound was a cry of terror, a child's voice, echoing across the campgrounds. It was followed by another scream, then another. The children, some of them, were terrified. Panic spread like wildfire as the sound of running footsteps filled the air. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the campers rushed back to their cabins. "Get inside," one of the counselors shouted, her voice panicked. "Go, go, go." Ethan watched as the last of the campers rushed past him, huddling into the safety of the cabins. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, grabbing one of the counselors by the arm. We don't know," the counselor stammered, her face pale. "Some of the kids, they heard the voices too, from the geysers." "What do you mean they heard the voices?" Ethan asked, his throat tightening. He couldn't believe it. They heard them calling their names," she said, her voice trembling. "One of them, a little girl, she followed the whispers. We couldn't find her. We've searched the whole camp, Ethan. She's gone." The next few days passed in a haze. The child who had vanished wasn't the only one. Ethan noticed that some of the campers were acting strangely, more withdrawn, their eyes darting nervously to the geysers whenever they heard the faintest murmur. They had heard it too, the whispers, the same voices calling them, urging them to follow, and some of them did. Each night the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and with each passing day another child went missing. One by one they disappeared without a trace, drawn into the depths of the camp's heart, the geysers where the whispers came from. The other campers were terrified, but they couldn't understand why. Ethan knew something was wrong. He had always felt the presence of something ancient here, but now it was impossible to ignore. As the whispers grew louder, he started to feel their pull like a force, something that reached inside of him and tugged at his very soul. He resisted it, but each night he found himself drifting closer to the geysers, as if something was calling him, beckoning him to come closer. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to find out what was happening before it was too late, before the whispers claimed another child. Ethan made his way to the geysers one night, long after the campers had gone to bed. He crept through the campgrounds, his breath heavy in the cold night air. The steam rose around him, the ground soft beneath his feet. He didn't know why, but something inside him told him that the answers lay here, within the depths of the geysers. The wind howled as he neared the geyser's edge. The whispers were clearer now, and they weren't just calling his name. "Ethan." The voice came from within the steam, the ground trembling beneath his feet as if the earth itself was breathing. He took another step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw them. Ash-faced spirits, their features twisted in agony, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They hovered in the mist, their forms indistinct, flickering like shadows. "Help us," one of the spirits whispered. "We are trapped, help us." Ethan froze. The spirits were desperate, reaching out toward him, their hands outstretched. He could feel their cold fingers brush against his skin, their touch like ice. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, his mind racing. This was it, the ancient curse. The camp's founders had trapped these spirits here, using a dark ritual to keep them contained. And now the children were being used as offerings, sacrifices to keep the spirits from breaking free. He had to stop this. He had to stop the ritual, but it was too late. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. More children vanished, their names lost to the wind. Ethan knew he had to act, but he didn't know how. The spirits were angry, restless, and they wouldn't stop until they had claimed their due. Ethan stood at the edge of the geyser field, the steam rising around him, and for the first time, he understood the true horror of the camp. It wasn't just the ghosts, it was the curse, the ritual that had kept them bound for centuries. And now it was slowly slipping from their control. The whispers had become a scream, and Ethan could hear the sound of footsteps behind him. But when he turned, there was no one there. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and for a moment he thought he felt something brush against his shoulder, something cold, something that wasn't human. The spirits were free now, and they were coming for him, shadows under the redwood pines. Samantha had always believed the redwoods were alive in some strange way, as if they possessed a hidden intelligence. The towering trees seemed to whisper in the wind, their ancient bark holding stories no one could comprehend. But now, as she stood in the clearing just beyond the camp kitchen, staring at the vast forest stretching into the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were watching her, waiting. The sun had long set, leaving only the faint glow of twilight to cast eerie shadows on the forest floor. The campers had retreated to their cabins, their excited chatter giving way to an unsettling quiet. The soft rustle of the leaves above was the only sound that remained, accompanied by the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the evening breeze. Samantha wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous habit she had developed over the years of working at the camp. Her thoughts were far from the pots and pans she had been scrubbing just moments before. There was something wrong in the air tonight. It wasn't the usual unease she'd felt when the forest seemed to come alive after dark. No, this was something deeper, something that gnawed at her insides. Her brother, Mark, had disappeared here 10 years ago. He'd been just a teenager, an eager camper who'd wanted to prove himself in the wilderness. He had ventured out into the forest alone, as campers often did in those days, to explore the area. The following morning, his friends had reported him missing. The camp had gone into full search mode, but no trace of him was ever found. The police had combed the woods for days, but all they found were strange marks on the trees and broken branches that led nowhere. The story of his disappearance had haunted her ever since. The rumors had spread, whispers of strange things in the forest, of doorways hidden beneath the roots of the great redwoods, leading to realms no mortal should enter. Samantha never truly believed those stories, but now, standing at the edge of the trees, something inside her felt as though the forest was reaching out for her, beckoning her to uncover its secrets. She turned toward the camp's dining hall, the warm light spilling from the windows, and forced herself to shake the feeling. "Get a grip, Sam," she muttered under her breath. But deep down, she knew she wasn't the same after Mark's disappearance. She had tried to bury it, to move on, but a part of her had always remained lost in those woods with him. That night, as the camp settled into an unnatural silence, Samantha sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The clock ticked steadily in the background, but her mind was elsewhere. She glanced at the small window that looked out into the dark expanse of the redwoods. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting out there. The trees, their massive trunks looming like silent sentinels, seemed to shift in the moonlight, their twisted forms appearing to move just beyond the edges of her vision. The voice had started as a whisper, so faint that she almost thought she had imagined it, but then it came again. A familiar voice, too close to her ear but distant all at once. Samantha! Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. It was Mark's voice. But how? He had been gone for so long. The voice echoed again, this time louder, clearer, carrying through the stillness of the camp. Samantha, come find me. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she set the mug down. She rushed to the window, peering into the darkness, her breath fogging the glass. She saw nothing. No movement, no sign of life, but the voice continued, now more urgent, more insistent. Please, I'm waiting. Come find me. Samantha's head spun. It was impossible. She had buried the memories of Mark's disappearance, convinced herself that the forest had taken him and that he was gone. But now, standing there, she felt the pull of his voice, like a thread tying her to a past she had desperately tried to forget. Her fingers gripped the windowsill, her knuckles white. The voice seemed to be coming from the trees, from the very heart of the redwoods themselves. She could hear the desperation in it, the way it seemed to call out to her, beckoning her into the forest. It wasn't just her imagination. It couldn't be. Without thinking, Samantha grabbed her flashlight from the counter and slipped into her boots. She had to go. She had to know what was happening. Mark was gone, but this voice, it was as if he were still out there, waiting for her. The cold night air hit her like a slap as she stepped outside. The camp was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves replaced by the oppressive silence of the forest. The trees loomed before her, their massive trunks like the walls of some ancient temple, dark and foreboding. Samantha took a deep breath and stepped forward, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the shadows, casting long, trembling shapes on the ground. The voice was there again, guiding her deeper into the woods, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's glow. It was coming from the direction of the old grove, a place the camp had always avoided after dark. She hadn't been there in years, not since the night Mark had disappeared. As she walked, the air grew colder, and the whispers around her seemed to grow louder, more distinct. They were no longer just words, they were commands. The trees themselves seemed to be guiding her, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, pulling her toward the grove. She was almost there now, standing at the edge of the darkened clearing. The towering redwoods stood like silent sentinels, their trunks black against the starry sky. And then she saw it. A figure, standing among the trees, cloaked in shadow. It wasn't Mark. The shape was wrong, too tall, too twisted, with eyes that gleamed like black holes in the darkness. The figure turned slowly, and Samantha felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't human. The creature's hollow eyes stared back at her, its mouth stretched into an eerie grin that seemed to flicker like a mirage. Its body was covered in tattered robes, and its hands, long and spindly, reached out toward her. The whispering grew louder, deafening, as if the entire forest had come alive with the voices of the lost. Samantha took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to do. The creature was moving toward her, its long limbs shifting unnaturally as if the forest itself had birthed it. She could hear Mark's voice again, but it was no longer a plea. It was a command, a warning. Run, Samantha, run. But it was too late. The creature lunged at her, and Samantha felt the world tilt on its axis. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her ears, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. She couldn't move. The air was thick, suffocating, and her lungs burned with the effort to breathe. The creature's hands reached out to her, its fingers long and clawed, each one twitching with malevolent energy. Samantha's body froze, her mind screaming for her to escape, but she couldn't. The voice, Mark's voice, echoed one last time in her mind, a single word. Run. But it was already too late. The darkness of the redwoods swallowed her whole. The cursed lake of Lake Tahoe. The summer sun hung low over Lake Tahoe, casting its golden light across the sparkling waters. The camp by the shore was quiet now, the last of the swimmers retreating from the cool lake as dusk began to settle over the mountains. The rhythmic sound of the waves lapping against the shore was soothing, almost peaceful. But to Marcus, the lifeguard standing alone on the dock, there was nothing peaceful about the lake. He had been here for a few months now, a routine summer job at the lakeside camp where he'd spent most of his childhood. But the lake had always felt wrong to him, even when he was a child. The way it glimmered under the sun, hiding its secrets beneath the calm surface. It was as if something beneath the water was waiting, biding its time just out of sight. Something that Marcus could never quite place. Something that had been there his whole life. Tonight was no different. As the campers retreated to their cabins, Marcus stayed behind, his eyes scanning the water as he leaned against the dock. The usual noises of camp, the chatter, the laughter, the squeals of children, faded into the distance. But there was something about the quiet that unsettled him. It was like the lake itself was holding its breath, waiting for the darkness to settle in fully. Marcus had been hearing things, whispers in the wind, murmurs carried on the night air. At first he thought it was just the stress of the job, the long hours under the harsh sun, and the isolation of the camp. But tonight, as the water rippled gently under the fading light, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The lake was calling to him. The first few weeks at the camp had been easy. He had been a lifeguard here as a teenager, and now, back as an adult, it seemed like nothing had changed. The kids were the same games, the same antics. But then the disappearances started. At first, it was subtle. A camper or two who went missing during swim time, never to be found. But the rumors started circulating fast. Whispers about the lake, whispers about the town beneath it. Marcus had always dismissed the stories as campfire tales, little more than idle gossip to entertain the campers during the long, lonely nights. But as the days went by and more campers disappeared, always during the swim, always near the deep end, he started to question whether there was more to it. He had heard it from the counselors, from the older staff, the legends they never talked about openly. But he had never really paid attention. Not until now. There was something in the water. As Marcus stood on the dock staring at the lake, a chill crawled up his spine. It was a strange feeling, like a pull, as if the water itself was trying to reach out to him, to drag him under. He looked down at his feet, watching the way the water rippled beneath him. And for a split second he thought he saw something move just beneath the surface. A shadow, a shape. But before he could focus on it, the wind picked up again, pushing the ripples outward. The shape was gone, replaced by the darkening reflection of the trees lining the shore. Marcus shook his head, brushing away the feeling. He had been out here too long. It was time to head back to his cabin and get some rest before the next shift. But as he turned to leave, the whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. Marcus. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was faint, but it carried a weight with it, familiar yet strange. He looked around, but the dock was empty. The lake stretched out before him, a vast expanse of water and darkness, and there was no one in sight. The whispering continued, louder this time, but it didn't come from the air. It came from the lake. "Marcus, come to me." He stepped back, his heart pounding. The air grew colder, the breeze sharp against his skin, and in the distance he heard something else, the faintest splash, like the sound of something moving just beneath the surface of the water. He squinted, trying to see through the darkening light, but all he could make out was the rippling water, the distant shapes of the trees, and the reflection of the camp's lights from the shore. But there was something there, something moving in the water. The next morning, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling. He was a professional. He had been trained to deal with the camp's activities, but this was different. Something was wrong with the lake, something that had been there long before he arrived. He spent the morning doing his rounds, checking the swimming area, watching the campers in the pool, but his mind kept drifting back to the whispers, to the shadow beneath the surface. During the evening, the whispers returned. Only this time they were clearer, more distinct, as if they were speaking directly to him. Marcus was standing by the dock again, his feet resting on the edge, his eyes scanning the water when the voice came again. "Come to us, Marcus." It wasn't a question, it was a command. He felt it in his bones, the coldness of the voice that seemed to seep into his very soul. He stumbled back, his pulse quickening as he looked around, but the camp was quiet. The campers had gone inside, and there were no staff members around to hear it. Suddenly, he remembered something. His mother's warnings. She had grown up near the lake, had spent her childhood in the camp before it was taken over by the new administration. She had told him stories, tales of a town buried beneath the lake, of souls trapped in the depths, waiting for new sacrifices each summer. He had dismissed it as superstition, as nothing more than the ramblings of a mother trying to protect her son. But now, standing on the edge of the water, he couldn't ignore the feeling that there was some truth to her words. Marcus had always thought his mother had left the camp for good when she moved away. But now, with the whispering voices calling to him from the water, he wasn't so sure. What if she had escaped the lake, but at a cost? What if her past here had been darker than she had let on? That night, as Marcus lay in his cabin, the whispering didn't stop. He could hear it in his mind as if it were coming from the walls themselves, echoing through his thoughts. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't escape it. The call was growing louder, more insistent, until he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know. The next day, Marcus went back to the lake. The water was still, its surface unbroken, reflecting the clear blue sky, but he knew better now. The calm surface was a lie. There was something waiting below. He knelt down at the water's edge, his hand hovering just above the ripples. The whispering voice came again, this time almost a caress, soothing in its desperation. "Marcus, come to us." His heart raced as he stepped into the water, feeling the cold seep through his shoes. The water lapped at his ankles, then his knees, and still the voice continued, pulling him deeper. He could see it now, shadows beneath the surface, vague shapes that twisted and turned like something trying to break free. It was then that he saw them. Hands, pale, waterlogged hands rising from the depth, reaching for him. And with them the faces, eyes wide and hollow, their skin slick and waterlogged, their hair tangled with seaweed. The drowned children, their bodies twisted and decayed, the remnants of souls trapped beneath the lake for generations. They reached for him, their voices growing louder, mingling with the sound of the water. "Help us, we need you." Marcus staggered back, his body trembling as he tried to pull himself away from the water, but the hands were faster. They grabbed him, pulling him down, their cold fingers digging into his skin, dragging him deeper into the lake. He struggled, gasping for air, but the water closed around him, choking him, drowning him in the cold embrace of the lake. And then, as his vision faded, he heard the voice once more, this time clearer than ever. "You are next, Marcus, just like your mother. blood trails in the Appalachian camp. The fog had settled in like a thick blanket, a silence so oppressive it felt as though the very air had been smothered by it. Claire stood at the edge of the clearing, the pale light of the moon filtering through the tall pines, casting long, eerie shadows across the camp. It was early morning, too early, and the camp still slept, unaware of the terror that had begun to creep through the Appalachian wilderness. The woods around the camp were ancient. Old, gnarled trees stood like sentinels, their twisted limbs reaching toward the sky in silent, skeletal testament to the passage of time. Claire had always loved the mountains, the way they held secrets, whispered stories on the wind. But tonight the air felt different, heavy, unwelcoming. There was something in the shadows that didn't belong. Claire had been working at the camp for 2 weeks, settling into the rhythm of her role as the arts and crafts instructor. The campers were kind, lively, full of energy, and their enthusiasm brought a sense of peace she hadn't realized she needed. She had enjoyed the quiet days, the laughter by the campfires, and the feeling of community. But in the last few days, something had shifted. The campers were becoming restless, uneasy. Whispers of strange happenings had started to circulate, rumors of people hearing footsteps in the woods at night, of strange noises coming from the direction of the old cabins that no one ever visited anymore. But the most disturbing thing had been the blood. It had started with just a few dark streaks on the bark of a tree. A strange sight, certainly, but nothing that had seemed out of place. After all, the forest was wild and untamed. It could have been anything, an animal, an accidental spill from the kitchen. But then it kept happening. Every morning there were more trails of blood, thick, dark streaks that trailed up tree trunks and ran in jagged paths across the forest floor. The blood was fresh, still glistening in the light of dawn as though something or someone had passed through during the night. At first, the staff had tried to brush it off. It was just the woods, they said. Animals fight in the night, bleed on the trees. But as the days wore on, the trails began to grow, winding through the campgrounds, leading toward the abandoned cabins in the far corner of the camp. The ones no one dared go near. And then one of the campers went missing. It was Emily, a shy girl who had arrived at camp only a few days ago, her wide eyes filled with wonder. She'd spent most of the first days crafting, creating necklaces from beads and smiling timidly at the other children. But one morning, she was gone, her bed untouched, her things scattered across the cabin in disarray. The only clue to her disappearance was the trail of blood that led from her cabin to the trees. Claire had found the trail herself, the dark smears marking the path like a silent invitation. The blood didn't end at the trees, though. It continued deeper into the woods, winding its way through the thick undergrowth toward the very place the children had been warned to avoid. The old cabins. Claire had thought about calling the authorities, but deep down she knew it wouldn't do any good. The mountain was ancient, its secrets older than anyone could comprehend. The things that lived in those woods were not bound by the same laws of nature as the world outside. No, this was something else entirely. That night Claire couldn't sleep. The blood trails, the whispers, and the sudden disappearance of Emily haunted her thoughts like a relentless ache. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The camp had stood for generations, but only now did it feel like it was rotting from the inside out, consumed by forces far darker than anyone had realized. She stood on the porch of her cabin, staring into the darkness. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, and the air had a sharp, biting quality to it. But there was something else beneath it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. It wasn't natural. It was the sound of something or someone moving in the woods. Claire's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She knew she shouldn't go out there. She knew it was foolish. But something urged her forward, the same pull that had brought her to the blood-stained trees in the first place. She crept through the woods, the tall pines casting deep shadows across her path. The moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy above her, and the ground was soft, wet from the recent rains. The bloodstains were still visible on the trees, leading her forward, pulling her deeper into the forest. Her footsteps were muffled by the thick underbrush, but every now and then she heard something else, the faint sound of something moving just out of sight. The trail led her to the edge of the old cabins. The buildings stood in eerie silence, their windows dark and empty, the wood rotting and covered in moss. Claire shivered as she stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached for the door to the nearest cabin. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved further in. The smell was musty, the scent of old wood and mildew lingering in the air. The room was empty, but there, on the far wall, was something that stopped Claire in her tracks. An old ledger lay open on the floor, its pages yellowed with age. She knelt down to inspect it, her fingers brushing across the brittle pages. The handwriting was faded but still legible. It was a list of names. Campers, counselors, families who had worked here, all written down in neat, careful script. But it wasn't just a list. It was a ledger of sacrifices. Names marked in red ink, dates that didn't match any historical record, and notes that spoke of rituals, strange ceremonies performed under the cover of night. And then she found it. Her grandmother's name was written there, Abigail Maynard, the same woman who had raised her after her parents died, the same woman who had warned her never to come to this place. Claire's pulse quickened. She had never known her grandmother's full story, only that she had left the camp when Claire was a child, leaving behind whispers of strange happenings. But now, reading those words, Claire understood. Her grandmother had known the truth all along. This camp wasn't just a summer retreat. It was a feeding ground. For generations, the camp had offered up its children to the spirits that roamed the Appalachian Mountains, to the skinwalkers who wore the faces of the lost. And Emily was not the first. Suddenly, Claire's blood ran cold as the door behind her creaked open. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no one there, or so she thought. A figure emerged from the shadows, its movements slow, deliberate. The creature was tall, its limbs long and unnatural, stretching in ways that made Claire's stomach churn. It was wearing the face of a child, a camper she had seen just the day before, but the eyes were wrong, hollow, dead, and when it spoke, it wasn't the child's voice at all. "Come with us, Claire. You're one of us now." Claire stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The creature's face twisted, the skin cracking open in places as if it were made of paper, revealing the darkness beneath. The blood-stained eyes of the skinwalker locked onto hers, and Claire could hear the faintest whisper in her ear. "You're next." The carnival that never left Louisiana swamps. The Louisiana bayou was always alive with sound, the chirping of insects, the distant croak of frogs, and the rustling of leaves that always seemed to whisper in some forgotten language. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Jared stood at the edge of the abandoned summer camp, a place he had known as a child but had long since forgotten. The overgrown weeds clawed at the edges of the decaying cabins, and the swamp's murky waters reflected the pale moonlight like a dark mirror. The camp had once been a place of laughter and sunlight, a retreat for families looking to escape the oppressive heat of Louisiana summers. Now, it was a place of rot, the wooden structures barely holding themselves together, the smell of mildew and decay thick in the air. As Jared walked further into the camp, he felt an unsettling sense of familiarity, but also an overwhelming dread. He had spent years trying to forget this place, but something had drawn him back. The camp had been abandoned for over 2 decades, but the memories of his childhood here still clung to him, like the creeping vines that now swallowed the cabins. He had come to fix things, replace some broken boards, fix the plumbing, clean the gutters. Simple things. The camp had been bought by a new owner who wanted to turn it into a retreat again, but Jared knew better. He knew what lay beneath the surface, what this place had been and what it still was. It wasn't just a camp, it was something darker, something that never truly left. As he walked past the old mess hall, the wind shifted. At first, it was a soft breeze, the kind that rustled through the trees and cooled the back of his neck. But then, something changed. The wind carried with it a sound, a faint, eerie melody, the unmistakable tune of carnival music. It was distant, barely audible, but it chilled Jared to the bone. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. The music was coming from the direction of the swamp. He listened, trying to make sense of it. Why would carnival music be playing out here in the middle of nowhere? The camp hadn't hosted a carnival in decades. Jared shook his head. He was imagining things. It was just the wind, the rustling of the trees. He turned to walk away, but the music grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed in his mind like a memory he couldn't escape. He stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. The music was real, it wasn't just in his head, and then he heard it voices. The unmistakable laughter of children, soft at first, then growing louder, closer. "Jared, come see." His name, spoken in a child's voice, clear as day. But there was something wrong with it, something off about the way it sounded. The laughter wasn't joyful. It was hollow. It was as if the sound of those children's voices was being forced, twisted by some unseen force. Jared's instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground. The music was too loud now, the carnival tunes dancing in the air, and the laughter of children, and something else, something darker, darker than anything he had ever heard, drifted from the swamp. And then he saw them. The figures standing in the shallow waters of the swamp, their faces pale and painted with grotesque smiles. Their eyes were wide, black voids devoid of life. They were clowns. Clowns in tattered costumes, their painted faces cracked and peeling, their bodies stiff like marionettes on invisible strings. The clowns were staring directly at him, their empty eyes locked onto his, and that's when he noticed the blood. Sawdust. The clowns bled sawdust, their arms jerking as if caught in the throes of some terrible dance. Jared's breath caught in his throat as he watched one of them, its mouth opening in a silent scream, release a cloud of dust from its hollow chest. The laughter of the children grew louder, now mixed with the low, creaking sound of the marionettes moving. The clowns reached toward the shore, their hands outstretched, and they were calling to him. "Jared, come play." Jared couldn't move. He felt trapped, held by the haunting rhythm of the carnival music. The whispers of the clowns beckoning him forward. The water around the clowns swirled, the mud beneath their feet shifting unnaturally, as if the swamp itself was alive, pulling them toward him, pulling him toward them. He didn't know how long he stood there, his feet frozen in place, his breath shallow, until the ground beneath him suddenly shifted. It wasn't the swamp moving. It was something far worse. He felt a hand, cold and wet, brush against his ankle, sending a wave of panic through his entire body. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The clowns were moving toward him now, their limbs jerking and twitching, their fingers stretching toward him, beckoning him closer. He could hear the faint rustle of candy wrappers, the sound of wrappers being torn open. One of the clowns held out a piece of candy, its face cracked in a grotesque grin. "Come on, Jared," the clown crooned, its voice warped and garbled. "Come take it. It's yours, all for you." The candy, the laughter, the whispers. Everything felt wrong, like a nightmare he couldn't escape, but his body refused to listen to his mind. He turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, his legs weak, his heart racing. He could hear the sound of the clowns chasing him, the wet slapping of their shoes against the swampy earth, their voices calling to him in mockery, urging him to stop, to play, to join them. "Jared, come back, you're one of us now." The music was deafening, louder now, almost as if it were inside his head, and the voices of the children were so close he could feel their breath on his neck. He didn't dare turn around. He couldn't. He didn't know what was chasing him, but he knew that if he looked, if he saw the horrors they were trying to show him, he would never escape. He reached the mess hall, his hands shaking as he grabbed the door handle and slammed it open, falling into the dimly lit interior. He collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, his mind racing, his body drenched in sweat. The laughter faded, the carnival music still echoing in the back of his mind. He sat there, hunched over, staring at the door, waiting for something to break through, but nothing came. The camp was silent again. The next day, when Jared returned to the campgrounds, he found something that chilled him to his core. The trail of the blood, the path he had followed, led straight to the swamp, and then to the old carnival grounds, a forgotten relic of the past. The sun was higher in the sky now, but the swamp felt colder, darker, as though it was hiding something just beneath the surface. It was then that Jared found the ledger. The ledger was old, its pages yellowed and torn, but the ink was still legible. It detailed the history of the camp, its founding, its rise to popularity, and its eventual decline. But it also spoke of something darker, something that had been kept hidden for years. The carnival. The drowned carnival that had once thrived on the edge of the bayou in the 1920s, attracting families and travelers from all over. It had been a place of joy, laughter, and music, but something had gone wrong. The spirits of the bayou, ancient, hungry spirits, had taken the carnival as their own. The camp leaders, desperate to protect the children from the curse, had resurrected the carnival as a way to keep the spirits satisfied, feeding them with the joy of the campers. Jared's heart sank as he read the final entry in the ledger. "The spirits are hungry, we must feed them." The carnival had never left. It had merely been waiting. And now it was calling again. The silent bells of Salem. The air in Salem always had a certain heaviness to it, as if the history of the place was not just something taught in textbooks, but something that lingered in the very air, that hung over the town like a fog. Rebecca had always felt it, ever since she arrived to teach at the small camp nestled near the old town. The whispers of the past were never far from her thoughts. History was her field of expertise. Her life was built on the belief that understanding the past helped illuminate the present. But in Salem, there was something else entirely. Something that seemed to have been forgotten but never truly gone. The camp itself was small, an old structure, quiet and weathered by time. It was a place for kids to learn about history, to live out stories of the past in the same way that Rebecca did every day in her lectures. But this camp, This strange piece of land on the outskirts of Salem seemed to have its own history, one that Rebecca had not been prepared for. It began with the bells. Every night, as the camp fell into its usual rhythms of late-night games and stories, Rebecca would hear the bell. It wasn't a loud clang or chime, but the distant echo of a bell tolling from the camp chapel. A soft, almost mournful sound, like a whisper from the past. The chapel itself was small, dilapidated, long unused except for the occasional visit from curious campers. The bell in the tower had been broken for as long as anyone could remember, or so she thought. But there it was, tolling every night, and with it something darker. The first time Rebecca heard the bell, it was at midnight. She had been grading papers in the camp's small office, surrounded by the quiet of the sleeping camp. The bell rang out through the stillness, sending a shiver down her spine. She had thought it must be some kind of prank, someone playing on the old, broken bell. But as the sound echoed through the camp again and again, she realized the truth. The bell was not broken. It was ringing, alive, as if something from the past had awakened, something tied to this land, to the history that Rebecca had spent her life studying. The second time it rang, someone died. The next morning, one of the campers, a young boy named Lucas, was found. He was found in the woods near the chapel, his body cold and lifeless, his eyes wide open in fear. No signs of struggle, no explanation. The camp was shaken, but they brushed it off as an accident. The boy must have wandered off, gotten lost, and somehow met his end in the woods. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. There had been no reason for him to be out there alone in the dark. And the bell, the toll that had echoed so loudly in her mind, haunted her, gnawing at her thoughts. As the days passed, the tolls continued and the deaths followed. A counselor, then another camper, each death eerily quiet, each discovery followed by the same shiver of dread. Each time the bell tolled, someone was taken. No one could explain it. No one could deny that something was happening. But what? Rebecca spent her nights researching. She dug into the history of Salem, deep into the archives of the town, into records that hadn't seen the light of day in generations. She read about the witch trials, about the executions, about the innocent lives destroyed by hysteria and fear. But there was something else, something she had never been taught in school, something buried beneath the history of those dark times. The bell tolled again, and this time Rebecca followed its call. Her feet carried her through the camp, through the darkened woods, until she stood before the chapel. It loomed before her, the weathered stones glowing faintly under the moonlight. She approached cautiously, feeling the weight of centuries of secrets pressing down on her. The chapel had once been a place of worship, of peace, but tonight it felt like a tomb. The door creaked open as she pushed it, the hinges protesting against the weight of years of disuse. Inside, the chapel was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the broken windows. The bell tower loomed above, empty, the remains of the bell's rope hanging limply from the rafters. Rebecca stepped forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. As she reached the center of the chapel, she felt it, an unnatural chill in the air, a presence that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was then that she heard it, the soft whisper, the barely audible sound that made her blood run cold. "You are cursed." She spun around, but the chapel was empty. The voice had come from the air itself, a cold breath that seemed to come from the very walls of the chapel. Her heart raced as she stumbled back, her hand clutching the old pew for support. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "You are cursed, Rebecca Mayfield. Your bloodline is bound to the witches of Salem." Rebecca's head spun. Her blood ran cold as the words sank in. She had always known there was something strange about her family, something unsettling. Her grandmother had been secretive, always avoiding certain topics. And now it was clear. She was tied to something far darker than she had ever imagined. The witches. The spirits of those condemned to death in the witch trials had been bound to the chapel. The bell was their prison, their eternal torment, and every time it rang, a soul was taken in payment. The bell was not merely a sound, it was a key, a marker of the spirit's hunger. And now, it seemed, Rebecca's bloodline was to pay the price. She had found her ancestor's name in the records, buried deep within the old town's archives. It was there, in the dusty pages of the trial records, that she found her ancestor's name, Judge Nathaniel Mayfield. The very judge who had sentenced the witches to death, the very judge whose decisions had sealed their fate. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest as the truth crashed down on her. Her family had been the ones to condemn them to the flames, and now her family would pay. Rebecca returned to the camp in a daze, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. She had been drawn here to this place by forces she could not understand. And now, as the days passed, the tolling of the bell grew louder, the spirits growing stronger. The children were terrified, the counselors were on edge, and the camp had begun to fall apart at the seams. Every night the bell tolled again, and every night someone disappeared. Rebecca knew she had to do something. She couldn't let the spirits claim any more lives. But the curse was ancient and the spirits were powerful. The bell had been their prison, and the town's bloodline, the Mayfields, had always been its keeper. She gathered the remaining campers and counselors, taking them to the chapel one final time. The bell tolled for the last time that night, its sound deep and ominous, echoing across the camp. Rebecca stepped into the center of the chapel, the place where the spirits had been trapped for so long. She spoke the words she had learned from the ancient records, words that had been hidden for centuries. It was a ritual, a binding ritual to sever the curse, to release the spirits from their prison. But as she spoke, she felt a cold hand grip her heart. The spirits were not gone, they were not freed, they were angry. They had been waiting for too long, and they were ready to take what was theirs. As the bell tolled one last time, the air grew thick and the walls of the chapel trembled. The spirits were rising, and Rebecca could feel them pulling at her, twisting her thoughts, clouding her mind. The bell tolled, and then silence. Ghost fires of the Mojave Desert. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly beneath the oppressive heat, its jagged hills and dry riverbeds offering little shelter from the sun. But at night, when the temperature dropped and the stars filled the sky like a blanket of diamonds, the desert took on a new kind of life. It was here, amidst the desolation, that Lucas found himself. Alone, save for the group of campers who had signed up for the survival course he was leading. The remote desert camp had always been a place of reflection, of quiet contemplation, but Lucas had never quite felt at home here. The desert had a way of swallowing things whole, leaving behind only memories, as if it were erasing its past with every gust of wind. Lucas had grown up in the desert, had learned to survive in its harsh environment, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that the Mojave held secrets it wasn't ready to share. There were stories, of course. Every desert town had its tales, the ones whispered in bars, in the dark corners of old motels. But there was one story that had stuck with Lucas from the moment he'd heard it, the story of the ghost fires. It was said that on certain nights you could see them from the camp, a flicker of orange light in the distance, burning against the night sky just beyond the hills. Phantom campfires, they called them. No one ever got close enough to investigate. Those who tried had never returned. The fires would burn bright for hours, then fade away, only to appear in a different spot the next night, as though they were following some pattern. The locals spoke of them in hushed tones, as if the very mention of the fires might bring them closer. But Lucas wasn't afraid. He had been trained to face the wilderness, to understand its dangers. The fires were just another part of the desert's mystery, something he could easily explain away. That was until the night he saw them for himself. It was a cool evening when Lucas first spotted the glow. He had just finished setting up the tents with the campers, giving them a quick briefing on what to expect from the night. The desert was unforgiving, but with his guidance they would make it through. He was confident, maybe too confident. He noticed the light out of the corner of his eye as he stood near the campfire, watching the flames dance. The glow was faint at first, barely visible against the horizon. But as the evening deepened, it became unmistakable. It flickered in the distance, a warm, inviting light in the otherwise barren landscape. Just the beginning of another desert mirage. He muttered to himself, trying to push the growing unease down, but something about the glow didn't feel right. It wasn't like the usual flickers of distant heat or the shimmer of the desert at night. No, this light was steady. It burned too brightly to be an illusion. As the night progressed, the glow grew stronger. Lucas couldn't resist. He grabbed a flashlight and motioned for a few of the older campers to follow him. "Stay close," he ordered, "and don't wander off. Keep your heads on a swivel." The campers followed dutifully, their eyes wide with curiosity, but there was a palpable tension in the air. They had all heard the stories, and now, standing at the edge of the camp, they too were drawn to the mysterious glow that beckoned from the darkened hills. They reached the site just after midnight, the air cold and still as they trudged across the dry, cracked earth. The desert seemed endless, stretching out into nothingness. But the fire was close now, just beyond the rise of the hills. As they crested the last dune, Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. There in the open desert was a fire burning, too real, too vibrant. But there was something wrong about it. The flames did not flicker as normal flames did. They rose, steady and unnatural, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. And the shadows cast by the fire were wrong, too, stretched and distorted in impossible ways. At first, it seemed like a normal campfire, the kind you might build to keep warm. But as Lucas and the campers moved closer, he saw the shapes around it, figures standing still, their outlines faint but unmistakable. They were soldiers, dark, ash-like forms with tattered uniforms, their faces obscured, their movements jerky and unnatural. Lucas felt a weight settle in his chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The soldiers didn't move as living beings did. Their bodies shuddered, their limbs jerking as if controlled by invisible strings, their eyes empty sockets, their mouths frozen in expressions of horror. They were trapped in some eternal moment, forever bound to the fire, to the desert, to the land itself. The fire burned on, unblinking, as though it fed on the souls of those around it. "What the hell is that?" one of the campers whispered, his voice shaking with fear. Lucas felt his throat tighten. "Stay back," he whispered. He knew better than to approach any further. The stories had always been vague, cryptic, but he now understood them all too well. The ghosts of the past, soldiers lost in some forgotten battle, had found a way to rise again. The fire was their tether, their prison, and it demanded a sacrifice. The soldiers' eyes locked on Lucas. They weren't alive, not in any real sense, but their gaze was cold, empty, and full of a hunger that made his skin crawl. The fire behind them seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the flames growing hotter, reaching higher, casting long, grotesque shadows that twisted and writhed in the air. Without warning, one of the soldiers took a slow, deliberate step toward the group. The earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the very air around them thickened, as if the desert itself was closing in. "I think we need to go now," Lucas said, his voice barely audible, his words quickening with panic. But before anyone could react, the figure lunged. It was too fast, a blur of motion, and Lucas barely had time to turn before a cold, dead hand grabbed him by the arm, pulling him toward the fire. "Run!" he shouted, struggling against the grip of the soldier, his heart racing as the other campers scrambled to flee. The figure that held him didn't feel human. It was cold and brittle, like a puppet whose strings had snapped, and yet it was impossibly strong. With a final desperate heave, Lucas broke free, stumbling back toward the camp, his mind reeling. The fire flickered in the distance, its glow searing his thoughts. As he turned to look back, the soldiers had disappeared and the fire had faded, leaving only the empty desert behind. The desert, once again, was silent. The next day, Lucas couldn't bring himself to speak of what he had seen. The campers were shaken, but they had to keep moving, had to finish the course. But as the days wore on, Lucas couldn't shake the image of the soldiers, the fire, the way their eyes had burned into his soul. He could still feel the cold grip of their hands, the way the desert had come alive around him. By the time they returned to camp, Lucas was a shell of the man who had come out to teach them survival. His eyes were hollow, his thoughts dark. He had learned something in the Mojave that he couldn't ignore. The stories weren't just stories. The ghost fires were real, and they were tied to something much older than the soldiers who once walked these lands. He had to know. He had to understand what had happened. He went to the camp's archives, pulling through old records and dusty books. That was when he discovered the truth. The camp had been built on the grounds of a long-forgotten battlefield. A massacre had occurred here during the early days of the 20th century, when soldiers had been sent to quell an uprising. The uprising had been brutal, and many lives were lost, but the soldiers had never left. The fire had never gone out. It had burned beneath the desert, feeding on the souls of the fallen. And now, Lucas realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach, he was a descendant of the general who had led those soldiers, the very man who had ordered the massacre. And the fire was calling him back. The forgotten orchestra of Central Park. The air in Central Park was thick with humidity that night. The kind of sticky warmth that wrapped itself around Naomi's skin like a second layer, leaving her restless and uneasy. She had spent most of the day preparing for the urban camp's end-of-week performance, a grand affair where the children would showcase the instruments they'd learned to play over the past few weeks. But it was difficult to concentrate, as the usual hum of the city felt louder tonight, drowning out the more familiar sounds of the park, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves. Something was off. Naomi sat in the camp's makeshift music room, tucked away in an old building just on the edge of the park, trying to focus on the sheet music in front of her. The sounds of the camp around her, the laughter, the chatter of campers running between tents, faded into the background as it often did. She had gotten used to it by now. Music had always been a means of escape for her, a way to silence the noise of the world. She ran her fingers over the strings of the violin, tuning it, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But it was the silence between notes that bothered her the most. The kids had been acting strange lately. At first, it was small things, glances over their shoulders, whispers, the occasional flinch when they thought no one was looking. Then the nightmare started. One by one, the campers had come to Naomi with stories of the violins, soft, eerie melodies drifting through the park in the middle of the night. At first, she had brushed it off as any sensible adult would. But then, more children began to speak of the same thing, violins playing in the dark, calling them, pulling them toward the tunnels beneath the park. Naomi tried to reason with them. It was just their imagination, she said. They were tired, their minds playing tricks. But the terror in their eyes made it harder to believe her own words. And when a few of them mentioned the tunnels under Central Park, long sealed off from the public, she couldn't ignore it any longer. The violins were real. It began one night when Naomi was walking back to the camp after a late rehearsal. The park was unusually quiet. The trees, which had earlier seemed full of life, now stood like silhouettes against the faint glow of the city lights. As she passed by a group of campers sitting by the edge of the park, she thought she heard it, a faint sound, barely audible above the bustle of the city. The distant, high-pitched hum of strings. A violin. No, not just one violin. There were several, their notes spiraling together in perfect harmony, rising and falling in a haunting lullaby. Naomi paused, her heart stopping for a moment as the realization hit her. It was coming from the direction of the tunnels. Central Park was full of forgotten passageways, remnants of the old subway system that had long been abandoned. She had heard the stories, how some of the tunnels were left to rot, now home to rats and the occasional daring urban explorer. But the sound, no, it was something else. The music, it was too real, too clear. She felt a strange tug as if the music was calling to her, guiding her toward the sound. Her legs moved before her mind could process it. She found herself following the faint melody, her breath shallow, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. Each step took her further into the darkened heart of the park, where the trees grew dense, the city noise muffled by the thick foliage. Naomi knew these paths well, she had walked them countless times, but tonight they felt unfamiliar. The shadows seemed deeper. The wind carried a chill that hadn't been there before. As she approached the mouth of an old, crumbling tunnel that led beneath the park, she stopped. The violin music was louder now, more intense. It felt like a live performance, the strings resonating through the ground beneath her feet, vibrating in her bones. She stood frozen in the dark, listening, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't want to face. There was something wrong about it. The music was too perfect, too precise. It wasn't like the kind of music she'd played or heard before. This wasn't just sound, it was a lure, a beckoning. Naomi. The voice came from the darkness, so soft that she almost didn't hear it. Her heart leaped in her chest as she spun around. There was no one there, but the music played on. The next day, Naomi decided to investigate. She gathered the children and explained that they would be rehearsing in the park, close to the area where the music had been coming from. She kept the mood light, trying to push the unease to the back of her mind. But the whispering in her ears, the soft, persistent hum of violins, was impossible to ignore. They gathered under the old, tall trees, a perfect spot for an impromptu performance, away from the distractions of the city. Naomi set up her violin, trying to focus, but the music from the night before still haunted her. It lingered, an invisible presence that hung over the children. Some of them had gone quiet, staring off into the distance, their eyes glazed. And then she heard it again, a faint note, barely there. At first it was a single distant string, a violin playing somewhere deep in the park. But as Naomi listened closer, she realized that it wasn't one violin, it was several. The sound seemed to echo in all directions, bouncing off the trees, growing louder with each passing second. Suddenly, one of the children, a little girl named Lily, stood up, her face pale, her eyes wide. "It's them," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They're calling me." Naomi rushed to her side, trying to pull her back toward the camp, but Lily turned, her feet moving against Naomi's grip. "No, I have to go to them. They're waiting for me." Before Naomi could stop her, Lily broke free and sprinted toward the sound of the music. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as she ran after her, but the child was faster, her small feet barely touching the ground as she vanished into the underbrush. By the time Naomi reached the spot where Lily had disappeared, she found nothing but a small, crooked path leading deeper into the forest, into the unknown. The music stopped. Later that night, Naomi couldn't sleep. The strange, perfect music still echoed in her ears, pulling at her. The next morning, the campers awoke to a silence that was far worse than the music. Lily was gone. There was no trace of her, no footprints leading out of the camp. The others spoke of hearing the violin music calling her to the trees, but no one had dared follow. Naomi's mind raced as she sifted through old records from the camp's earlier years. There was little information about its history, just vague references to its founding, the usual paperwork. But as she flipped through one of the old ledgers, she found something that made her blood run cold. A name, a list of staff members, some of whom had worked at the camp long before it was established. Her eyes skimmed down the list, and there in the margins was a name she didn't expect to see, her father's name. But it wasn't just that. It was the connection to the camp's original director, a man who had led the camp during the 1920s, a man who had mysteriously disappeared, never to be found again. But his name wasn't the only thing that stood out to Naomi. It was the note next to it. "This man performed here at night, played the violin. He vanished the same night the accident occurred. The others have not yet left." The note sent a wave of dread through Naomi as she made the connection. The music, the violins, the voices. Her father had been one of them, one of the spectral musicians who had been trapped in the tunnels after the subway collapse. He had died, just as the others had, buried in the wreckage, but his music had never ceased. And now, Naomi understood, it wasn't just a call, it was an invitation. The music wasn't just a performance, it was a trap. It fed on the souls of those who were drawn to it, those who could hear the music. The spirits of the musicians were caught in an eternal cycle of performance, doomed to play for all eternity. And now Naomi's father, lost, forgotten, was among them. The violin piece she had been playing, it was the same one, the same music. And now she knew why it had called to her. Midnight riders of the Rocky Mountains. The air in the Rocky Mountains was thinner than usual that night, a cold breeze sweeping down from the peaks, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Daniel, the horseback riding instructor, stood on the porch of the camp's main cabin, his eyes scanning the vast wilderness that stretched before him. The mountains were jagged silhouettes against the inky black sky, their towering forms only partially visible in the dim light. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the land seemed to stretch on forever, as if it held secrets older than the earth itself. The camp near Rocky Mountain National Park had been his refuge for the past few summers. It was meant to be a peaceful place, away from the city, away from the noise of the world, where kids could learn the art of horseback riding and reconnect with nature. But lately, there had been a growing tension in the air, an unease that hung over the camp like a storm waiting to break. The horses, once docile and friendly, had become restless. Their eyes, once calm and trusting, now held a dark glint that Daniel couldn't ignore. It started slowly with odd incidents, strange hoofbeats echoing through the woods at night, horses snorting and stamping in their stalls for no apparent reason. Daniel had chalked it up to the wild nature of the mountains, the sounds of animals in the distance, or maybe a lingering storm cloud. But as the days passed, the occurrences grew more frequent and more unsettling. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the camp was filled with the usual sounds of laughter and chatter. The campers had spent the day riding the trails, their faces flushed with excitement, their spirits high. Daniel had kept a watchful eye on them as he always did, making sure they stayed safe. But that night, as the camp settled into the usual nighttime routine, something felt wrong. The air was too still. There were no crickets singing, no rustle of leaves in the wind. And then it happened, the sound of hooves. At first, Daniel thought it was one of the horses in the stables, restless as usual. But the sound grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable, galloping, fast, urgent, like something was chasing it. The hooves struck the earth in a rhythm that was both frantic and deliberate, each beat sending a ripple of unease through the camp. Daniel's heart raced as he moved toward the stable. He knew every horse by name, by temperament. None of them were out in the fields. All the stables were locked tight, so where were the sounds coming from? He stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold air, and froze. The sound of galloping hooves was now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of shouting, distant but echoing through the night. And then there was a scream, a raw, gut-wrenching scream that seemed to come from nowhere. "Daniel, help!" It was a voice he didn't recognize, a camper, or so he thought, but there was no one to be seen. The next morning the camp was in disarray. 3 campers were missing, vanished without a trace. Their cabins were empty, their belongings left behind in a hurried mess. The only clue was the faint smell of horse sweat, lingering in the air like a reminder of the previous night's horrors. And the hooves, those galloping hooves, still echoed in Daniel's mind, the rhythmic pounding that had followed him all the way back to his cabin. He gathered the remaining campers and counselors, trying to keep a sense of calm in the midst of the panic. But deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. This wasn't a simple case of children running off into the mountains. This was something darker, something that had been waiting. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy slumber, the sound of hooves returned. But this time it wasn't just an echo. This time it was closer, much closer. The hooves struck the ground with a heavy, deliberate rhythm, and Daniel could feel them vibrating through the earth beneath his feet. He rushed to the stables, his pulse quickening, his mind racing with the knowledge that whatever this was, it was not natural. As he reached the edge of the camp, he saw them. Riders cloaked in shadow, their figures blurry in the darkness, riding toward him on horseback. But there was something wrong with them. Their heads were gone, their necks a hollow void where faces should have been. They galloped silently, their horses' hooves cutting through the air like knives, their bodies swaying unnaturally with the rhythm of the ride. The sound of their hooves was deafening now, a cacophony that seemed to drown out everything else. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as one of the riders passed just in front of him, its empty neck staring directly at him as if it could see him. He could feel the weight of their gaze, even in the absence of eyes. The riders were not of this world. They were spirits, soldiers or cowboys, or something else entirely, trapped in this endless cycle, cursed to ride through the night, forever seeking replacements. The riders came closer, their horses' hooves pounding against the ground, shaking the earth beneath Daniel's feet. He could feel the heat of the horses' bodies, the strange, unnatural warmth that emanated from them. The riders didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to send a chill through his body, a coldness that wrapped itself around him like chains. "Run," one of the riders seemed to say, though the words were not spoken. The sound was not audible, but somehow Daniel could hear it in his mind, in his soul. "Run or join us." Daniel didn't need any more encouragement. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath ragged as he sprinted toward the safety of the camp. Behind him, the riders' hooves echoed in the darkness, their sound growing louder with every step. He didn't stop until he reached the main cabin, slamming the door behind him and bolting it shut. The sound of the riders faded, but the fear did not. He could still feel their presence, the weight of their gaze pressing down on him. The days that followed were filled with frantic searching. The campers were terrified, the counselors on edge, but there was no sign of the missing children. The riders had not come again, but the memory of them, their empty faces, their cold, lifeless bodies haunted Daniel. It wasn't just the riders, it was the horses. The horses were part of it too. They were the tether, the connection between the living and the dead, between the cursed world of the riders and the camp. And Daniel knew now that the riders had come for the campers, to take them, to replace them in their endless ride. But there was something more, something that had been waiting for him, something that he couldn't escape. That night, as the full moon rose high above the mountains, Daniel returned to the stables. He didn't know why. He had to go. Something called him there, something deep inside of him that couldn't be ignored. The horses were still there, their eyes dull, their bodies trembling as if they too could feel the pull of the riders. But one horse stood apart from the others. It was a dark stallion, its coat as black as the night itself. Its eyes, too, were black, but they were not empty. They gleamed with a strange intelligence, a knowing that made Daniel's skin crawl. He reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it on the horse's neck. The stallion snorted softly, its body warm against his touch, and then in a voice that only Daniel could hear, it spoke. "I can help you," it said, its words low and almost melodic. "I can save you from them." Daniel pulled back, his breath caught in his throat. The horse was offering him salvation, but at a price. The riders had chosen him, and they would not stop until they had taken him. But the stallion, this creature, this spectral beast, could save him. It could protect him from the curse of the riders. But at what cost? The stallion's eyes bore into his soul, and Daniel knew what he had to do. He stepped forward, placing his hand on the horse's mane, feeling its power surge through him, filling him with a strength he hadn't known he had. The horse lowered its head, as if accepting him, as if it were already bound to him. "Your life is mine," the stallion whispered, the words echoing in his mind. "But I will save you, I will protect you from them." Daniel closed his eyes, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. The stallion was offering him a chance, a way out, but it would cost him his life, his soul, but the riders would take him anyway, and so he made his choice. The next night the riders came again, their hooves shaking the ground, their bodies cloaked in shadows. But this time, they did not ride alone. The stallion stood beside Daniel, its dark form glowing with an otherworldly light. The riders halted, their empty necks swiveling toward the stallion, their eyes filled with fury. The battle was silent, but the earth trembled beneath their hooves. Daniel stood at the center of it, his heart pounding, knowing that the price of his salvation was now paid. The riders faded into the darkness, their presence vanishing with the first light of dawn. And Daniel, standing alone in the cold morning light, knew that he had made his choice. But the stallion's gaze remained with him, its promise of protection a constant reminder of the price he had paid. The riders had been banished for now, but the price would be collected eventually. And when it was, Daniel would be ready. The final camp, Alaska's eternal night. The Alaskan wilderness was a place where the sun barely touched the earth for weeks at a time, leaving the camp trapped in a perpetual twilight. Isabella, the camp director, had always felt drawn to this place, a remote corner of the world far from the distractions of modern life. Here, in the frozen embrace of Alaska, she had built a camp for children, a refuge from the chaos of the outside world. But lately, the camp had become a different kind of refuge, one that she no longer understood. Isabella stood at the edge of the camp, her eyes tracing the horizon where the dark, snow-covered mountains met the black sky. The stars above were brilliant, cold pinpricks in the void. Yet, despite the beauty of the landscape, a creeping sense of dread had taken root in her heart. The days were long gone, replaced by the endless nights of winter, where the sun did not rise for weeks. In the isolation of the remote camp, the hours seemed to stretch on forever, blending together in a haze of cold and darkness. The children had arrived with their usual excitement, eager for the adventure of a winter camp in the wilds of Alaska. But over the last few nights, Isabella had noticed something unsettling. The campers, usually full of energy, had become lethargic. They slept longer, their movements slow and sluggish. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, as if the life had been drained from them. And each morning, Isabella found them more and more difficult to wake. She had chalked it up to the long nights. Perhaps the constant darkness was affecting their sleep patterns. But deep inside, she knew something was terribly wrong. The feeling in her gut told her that the camp was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a trap. The first incident had been subtle. A child named Ella, no older than 8, had fallen asleep during dinner, her head drooping against the table. Isabella had thought it was nothing more than exhaustion from the activities of the day. But when they tried to wake her, she didn't stir. Her body was warm, but her breath was shallow, almost imperceptible. At first, they had assumed she was simply overtired. But as hours passed and she didn't wake, panic began to settle in. The other children, one by one, began to fall into the same deep, unshakable sleep. They would nod off at odd moments in the middle of a game or during the evening storytelling session. And then they wouldn't wake. The counselors began to whisper among themselves, and Isabella felt a growing unease, like the weight of something ancient pressing down on her chest. That night she stood watch. Her eyes were wide open, alert, scanning the camp's dark edges, but there was no sign of movement. The wind howled in the distance, carrying the scent of snow and ice, but the camp itself was still, too still. The children, wrapped in thick blankets, lay in the cabins, their faces peaceful in the dark, their bodies unmoving. But it was the shadows that drew her attention. She had first noticed them that evening as she made her rounds through the cabins. The shadows seemed to move independently of their source, shifting and flickering as though they had lives of their own. Isabella dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the flickering light of the campfires or the shadows cast by the wind in the trees. But as the night grew deeper, the shadows became more distinct, more deliberate. And then she heard the whispers. They started softly, like the wind passing through the trees, but soon they grew louder, clearer. The voices were not the sound of children or counselors, but something darker, something older. They spoke in hushed tones like a prayer or a chant, but the words were unintelligible. It was a sound that made her skin crawl, a sound that resonated deep within her bones. The shadows began to grow more pronounced, swirling around the cabins, moving like dark tendrils in the night. They were drawn to the sleeping children, creeping under the doors, gathering around their beds. Isabella watched in horror as one of the shadows reached out, brushing against Ella's sleeping face, its tendrils curling around her like a serpent. Ella's breath hitched in her sleep, but she didn't wake. Isabella had seen enough. She gathered the remaining campers and counselors, her heart racing as she tried to maintain composure. There was no time to waste. The children were no longer simply sleeping, they were being consumed. The shadows, the whispers, they were connected to something far older than the camp, something far darker. Isabella had learned in her research that this area of Alaska was known for its ancient legends, whispers of a creature that fed on dreams. And now it seemed those legends were true. The shadows, she realized, were not just shadows, they were dream feeders. These creatures, born of darkness and forgotten fears, thrived on the energy of human dreams. They were drawn to the deepest sleep, feeding off the essence of those who lay unaware, until the bodies were drained, until nothing remained but empty husks. The children, like all who came to the camp, had become offerings to them. Isabella's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. She had always believed that the camp was meant to help children, help them connect with nature, to experience the raw beauty of the wilderness. But it was more than that. The camp had been built atop an ancient burial ground, a place where dream feeders had once been trapped by the old ones. The very land the camp sat on had been a means of keeping these creatures contained. But now, with the arrival of the camp's first generation, the dream feeders had begun to stir. And the camp, built over the ruins of an old settlement, had become a source of food for them. But Isabella's bloodline was tied to the camp's founding. She had inherited the responsibility of maintaining the balance, of keeping the dream feeders at bay. And now, as the creatures grew more powerful, as the shadows consumed the children in their sleep, she knew what she had to do. That night the camp was quieter than ever. The children slept, their bodies limp in their beds, the shadows curling around them like a dark tide. Isabella stood alone at the center of the camp, the cold wind whipping around her, her breath visible in the freezing air. The moon above was a pale sliver, barely illuminating the land below. But she could feel them, the dream feeders, lurking in the darkness, waiting for her to make the ultimate sacrifice. Isabella had always known that she would one day be called to make a choice, but she had never imagined it would come to this. The camp, her home, had always been a place of safety for her, a refuge from the rest of the world. But it was also a prison, trapping the children, trapping her, and she had failed. The ritual was simple, ancient, and yet brutal. To sever the connection between the dream feeders and the children, to send them back into the shadows, Isabella had to offer herself as the final sacrifice. Her blood, her soul, these were the price. But she had a choice: to remain and watch the children suffer, or to end it all, to sever the bond forever and free them from the dream feeder's grasp. Her father's face flashed in her mind, the man who had founded this camp, who had been so intent on providing the children with something more. She had inherited his legacy, his responsibility, and now she would finish it. The wind howled around her as Isabella walked to the center of the camp, where the ancient totem stood, a relic from a time long past. It was a symbol of protection, of balance, of the old ones who had kept the dream feeders contained. She knelt before it, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was about to do. The shadows gathered around her, thick and oppressive, as if sensing the change in the air. The dream feeders were waiting. She could feel their hunger, their need to feed, but she would not let them take any more lives. As Isabella placed her hand on the totem, a surge of energy coursed through her. The shadows writhed, screaming in a language that was both familiar and alien. She whispered the incantation she had learned, words spoken by her ancestors, words that would break the curse and send the dream feeders back to the abyss from which they had come. The earth trembled beneath her, the wind shrieking in fury, but Isabella did not falter. The shadows twisted around her, but she held her ground, her voice steady as she completed the final words of the ritual. The ground cracked open beneath her, the dream feeder's presence pulling back, retreating into the darkness. And then the camp was silent. The next morning the children awoke, their eyes clear, their bodies strong. The shadows had vanished, and with them the nightmare that had haunted the camp for so long. But Isabella was gone. Her sacrifice had sealed the bond, and the camp would never be the same. The children would go on to live their lives, their dreams no longer plagued by the darkness. And Isabella would be remembered not as a victim, but as a hero, her name etched into the history of the camp, a symbol of the price that must sometimes be paid to keep the light shining in the darkness. Throughout this chilling journey across 10 haunting summer camps, each story has explored the profound depths of terror, the weight of secrets buried in forgotten places, and the inexorable pull of the past on the present. Each protagonist, from Ethan in the geyser-filled Yellowstone to Isabella in the eternal night of Alaska, faced overwhelming horrors that tested their courage, their resilience, and their very understanding of what is real. They were all drawn into situations where forces beyond their comprehension manipulated not just their fates, but the fates of those around them. From spirits trapped in the bowels of forgotten chapels to phantom riders galloping through the desert, these protagonists were forced to confront the ancient evils that had lingered for centuries, waiting for the right moment to break free. The ghosts, the shadows, and the horrors that emerged from deep within the earth or beyond the veil of reality were never just the products of imagination. They were representations of the past's long-held grudges and unhealed wounds. Yet, in each of these stories, we see something deeply human: the struggle for survival, the longing for peace, and the eventual acceptance of the sacrifices required to break the cycle of suffering. The recurring theme of sacrifice, whether it was Isabella offering herself to end the curse or Naomi confronting her lost father's spirit, reflects a painful but necessary reality. Sometimes, to break free from the chains that bind us, we must give something of ourselves. These characters didn't just fight against the supernatural, they fought against their own fears, histories, and destinies. Ultimately, each protagonist, despite their fear, found their way to confront the horrors in front of them. Some were victorious, others sacrificed everything to ensure the safety of others, but they all changed in the process. Their journeys force us to ask, what are we willing to sacrifice to free ourselves from our own haunted pasts? And more importantly, what horrors in our lives have we been running from, only to realize that the true challenge lies in facing them head-on? The greatest lesson from these terrifying tales is that we must not shy away from the things that haunt us. The spirits in these stories were not just entities of the supernatural. They were manifestations of guilt, unresolved trauma, and the weight of actions that had never been dealt with. Similarly, in our own lives, we must confront the parts of ourselves that we fear, the emotions we've buried, and the pasts we've been running from. Avoiding or suppressing our fears only gives them more power. Instead, facing them, however difficult, can set us free. Just like the characters in these stories, the path to peace often requires a personal sacrifice, a letting go of old habits or toxic patterns, and an acceptance of the uncomfortable truth about ourselves. By embracing our fears and traumas, we can rewrite our own stories, turning them from sources of terror to catalysts for personal growth. Much like the characters, we may not have control over the horrors that come our way, but we always have control over how we respond. What we choose to face and how we choose to deal with it will ultimately define who we are and the life we lead. What do you think about the themes of these stories? Do you believe facing our fears is the only way to break free from the chains of the past? What's your perspective on the personal sacrifices we often need to make to heal? Feel free to leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. I'd love to hear your insights, and let's discuss together. And if you enjoyed this chilling journey through the haunted camps, make sure to subscribe to our channel to support us. Your subscription helps keep the motivation alive for creating more terrifying and thought-provoking content in the future. Together, we can dive even deeper into the shadows and explore more stories that will send shivers down your spine. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some stories are meant to be told and faced.